Panel is entitled Gamification for Community Engagement and Volunteer Recruitment, but it really need not be that specific. This is really a panel sort of about engagement of stakeholders and constituents in a very broad sense, and sort of in the interest of full disclosure, my focus is primarily arts and culture and history heritage based nonprofits in Greater Philadelphia, but this is a very broad topic, including other nonprofit sectors, education, healthcare, social service, et cetera. So we want to keep we can have the conversation be very expansive. How many people here, Gabe did this at the beginning, but how many people here run or associated, involved in nonprofits? Okay. How many in the sort of arts and culture sector? All right. This is a little bit of arbitrary, self-identification here. Education, social services, other than the above. Okay.
So very quickly, I teach game developers, but I also have a strong belief as a professor in service work as part of a student's career in high school and college. So my college students have built websites for not-for-profits. They've built learning games for the OLPC, XO community, and done a lot of open source work as well. So we do a whole bunch of things at RIT with not-for-profits. We do a lot of games for museums. I'm a visiting scholar at the Strong Museum in Rochester, which is also now a huge game museum as well as a children's museum. And I'm chairing the IGDA, for those of you who don't know what that is. It's the International Game Developers Association. We started a SIG on learning, education, and games, which you can join just by going to igda.org and signing up and hitting the Google group. It's free. Very active community that's just starting there. So there's lots of different ways to engage. What I wanted to do today is talk really quickly about these three efforts, not because they're specifically cool or awesome or world-shattering in and of themselves, but because they address three different types of communities, not-for-profits, with three different goals and three different audiences. And I want to kind of put it out there as different ways to think of what gamification and social games can bring to what it is you guys do. Okay, so next slide, please. All right, so our first suicidal run at doing gamification and social games as a faculty and student craft was this thing called Picture the Impossible, which is now over, which you can see at picturetheimpossible.com. But the goal was to work with the local newspaper to bring, Gannett chain local newspaper, to get Rochesterians out of their hovels, experiencing the city. Rochester has an amazing history. It's like Philadelphia for civil rights. It's where the women's movement was. It's where Frederick Douglass spent the better part of his career. It's where there's been a lot historically of innovation, of technological innovation, of religious innovation. The Fox sisters and the whole spiritualist church started there. The Shakers are just down the road. The Mormons started their New York trek, eventually in Utah, just down the road. It's really this wild melting pot of historical madness. And we wanted to kind of get people out and about and doing stuff. And to do that, we not only engaged them in a social game, but we made sure that the social game benefited charitable organizations in town. Next slide, please. So this is a really quick, tiny piece of what the game looked like. It was a 3-month run, and it used web games, physical games in the newspaper, physical games outside in the real world, on the weekends, scavenger hunts, things like that. We had a baking contest, all kinds of things. There were 3 factions. You participated as an individual and as a member of the team. As the individual, you earned points for yourself. As a member of the team, you were earning dollars for your charity. You picked 3 charities, and each charity was attached to a historical faction. There's a whole backstory of 3 underground groups vying for the history of Rochester back in the day. You're learning about this as you go, and a lot of the stuff was themed around that. So as a team, as a faction, you competed to get the biggest check for your organization. As an individual, the top 150 badge winners or scorers got to come to a big party at the end of the game. We had the end of the party on Halloween. Everybody was dressed in costumes, so on and so forth. A real big experiment. No one had done an ARB before working with a local newspaper, so we did things like there would be picture assembly puzzles, and only one piece of the puzzle would be printed in one region where the newspaper was distributed. So you actually had to get people from around the town together to put their pieces together to make the picture and win the achievement, right? Move through like that. Roughly 2,500 people played, and it was really transformative for a lot of people who said, oh, we never got out, or oh, we got to do this with our kids, or just a huge response to what we did. So they proposed, just kind of off the cuff, this is from one of their graphic designers, about a year and a half ago, something they were calling the Fedora RPG, which looked primarily like a gamification / badging / avatarish type of system. This is interesting in a way, it's a different community in a way, because these are people who are wildly intrinsically motivated already. Right? We can talk about what intrinsic and extrinsic motivation are as we get further down the road. But these are already serious communities of practice that crank immense amount of hours over a given year working together. Right? So unlike these other two, which had more loosely defined organizations, communities, teams, here's one where this stuff is already hardcore. A lot of the stuff you're looking to drive already exists. So what's going to happen, and how are we going to work to leverage that? Next slide, please. What we're going to try to do is take advantage of some mechanisms that are already out there. This is a thing called coderwall.com. And Coderwall is a badging system that works kind of under the hood. You sign up for it, and in the open source community, you have various forms of very social, like GitHub, or much less social coding communities. Anytime in the open source world you contribute to a product, you make a commit, you put something in a repository for other people to share. And there are lots of systems that track what you have added to the overall corpus of the code, its documentation, its graphics, whatever. And so this system, after you've signed up, pulls all of the projects that you work on and automatically assigns you badges based on the commitments you've made. So once you sign up, much like a loyalty program, and your ID is in the system, right? Every time you do something, ka-ching, you get the badge.
I'm the director of something called the Hive Learning Network in New York City. There's also a Hive Learning Network in Chicago, and we're sister networks. I'm going to be speaking a little later on today from 1 to 1:30, where I'm happy to dig in a little bit deeper on some of these things if you're interested. So I won't do too much of that now. Basically, the Hive Learning Network is part of MacArthur Foundation's digital media learning work that they've been working on for about the last 6 or 7 years, with the idea being that school is but only one node in a learner's sort of lifetime, and here really falling on tweens and teens as we describe them. So the idea was that how do we make more robust, transparent, and connected the ecosystem of learning opportunities that aren't school in large urban settings, and thus the learning network concept was born. So you can see over about the 3 years of the lifespan of the network, these are our members, so you can see a pretty vast array of city culturals in New York City, some of these being national organizations as well. Everything from huge cultural institutions like American Museum of Natural History or the public library systems of New York, Queens, and Brooklyn, to smaller organizations or mid-level, operating budgets of more reasonable than American Museum of Natural History, and then literally very small, scrappy startup nonprofits like a group like World Up that uses hip hop and street culture as a way into software and physical computing hacking, which operating budget floats anywhere from $30,000 to $40,000. So the network sort of doesn't, anyone can contribute to the network culturally, these institutions, and sort of squashes the playing field from the sort of large cultural players to the very small. So the other big partner in this work in New York City is that we are part of the Mozilla Foundation and part of Mozilla's work. The foundational aspect of Mozilla has really recalibrated its efforts into learning, and so the Hive Learning Network is a piece of that project. What really makes that exciting is that one of the other learning projects within the MoFo world is their open badge infrastructure, the OBI. Has anyone followed any of that badges for learning over the last about year? Okay. So sort of taking on what's already been talked about with badges and trying to blow them out even a little larger in a number of ways. One, explicitly making them about learning and ways to assess, track, highlight, and give power to people that have that learning, and then it becomes transactional through the badges to other aspects of their life. Now, as soon as you open up this sort of badging into sort of the educational world, it gets a pretty hefty blowback because most people smacks of things like behaviorism and, what's the difference between extrinsic and intrinsic motivators. And so that's something that that this project's been very happy to sort of parse out and have an honest conversation around. While we think it might be different in the learning context with the open badges work, is that one, they'll be tagged with metadata that the issuer can put in the metrics and assessments that went to issuing the badge.
Not to interrupt you, but you haven't actually explained what it is, and it's really cool.
Oh, yes, that's a good point.
What it is.
I went right for learning. Sure. So Mozilla's OBI is basically a marketplace for badges, and that's going to create the open source system where issuers and issuees can interact. And so if you've got a badge, then you put it into the OBI, and then the OBI will then be the system in which badges can be issued. But for the issuee, it really, being Mozilla, really respects privacy. So you get what they're now calling, and might change, your learning backpack. And so if someone issues you a badge, you can immediately say, that badge is garbage, I want no connection with that, and block it. So you're not beholden to someone issuing you a badge. The second thing is that I'd like to accept that badge, but I would not like to display it for whatever reason. And third is that you display it on your backpack, and you can also push it out to various places. So go to a Facebook, go to an online resume. So, and also Mozilla is relatively agnostic about what those badges are, and puts most of the power in the issuer in terms of what it means to get that badge, what are the assessments, what are the metrics. The little asterisk to that is that Mozilla will certainly be issuing its own badges around, web making skills. So they'll have a little piece of that as an issuer, but really the platform is about the interaction between the issuer and the issuer.
You write that in your LinkedIn profile. Like you say, I did a Ruby 101 course, but nobody knows if that's true, right? And it's not a particularly meaningful way to describe it. You might forget to describe it, whatever. So the concept here is anybody can issue, any institution can issue this for micro-educational accomplishments, just as you as a nonprofit can start issuing them to your volunteers and your trainees. Like someone who takes your field training course on how to go do harm reduction should earn one of those, which then is a portable and transferable and meaningful thing that a potential employer can click on, and that takes them to the page that you created that explains what it is that badge. I mean, this is incredibly disruptive to classic education.
Yes,
to me, it's so exciting, and I don't know if I don't know if this will be the one that wins, or if there'll only be this one platform or whatever. But it's an amazing project. Amazing.
But let me just tell you a little bit about me and what I do in the space. So next slide. On the top left, that's me. About 7 years ago, one of my colleagues at Wharton said, hey, there's this cool new massively multiplayer online game called World of Warcraft, and we're starting a guild with a bunch of games researchers, people who are scholars who actually study games professionally. You want to join? And I said, sure, that sounds like fun. I play games, and about 3 years later, I woke up in a roadside ditch. And then when I remembered what had happened, it was mind-blowing, because the level of detail of the experiences that people built in a game like WoW was extraordinary. The sophistication of the social interactions, the sophistication of the systems and sites that people built outside of the games, the kinds of behaviors that you saw in terms of leadership and teamwork that just sprung up from people playing this game were fascinating. But unlike most of the people in the guild who were sociologists and anthropologists and learning specialists and so forth, who were studying this in their work, I'm a legal and technology scholar at a business school. So it wasn't until, thankfully, people like Gabe came along and started to articulate the concept of gamification that I had a way to plug in the fascination I had with games and the potential of games more broadly with the things that I do in my day job. And so the last year or two, I've been involved in a number of initiatives. One of them was with the colleague Dan Hunter, was already mentioned, held the first academic symposium on gamification last fall at Wharton. We then taught the first, as far as I know, the first university course on the topic last fall, and we're doing it again and expanding it this lecture in front of a room of people, or even a traditional online course where you all sign up and we'll have 10 or 20 or 50 or 100 of you on your computer in the online course. These are courses designed for massive scale. Some of the ones that have been done to date have had over 100,000 people in them taking courses on things like artificial intelligence all around the world. And so there's actually 2 startups that were founded out of Stanford. One of them is partnering with Penn as well as Princeton and Michigan to bring faculty from these schools to teach these open courses. I'm doing one on gamification for a company called Coursera. It'll probably start around July. I think I have the URL on the last page, but if you Google Coursera, C-O-U-R-S-E-R-A, the course on gamification is, again, open to anyone for free, and we'll cover a lot of this kind of stuff. All right, so briefly on gamification and nonprofits. So get the next slide. Gabe gave this great example of Fold It, which is one that people point to about how game mechanics and game-based approaches can be useful in nonprofit social impact kind of context, and that's absolutely true and very good. But if I get the next slide, the differences are not that great between gamification being used in those kind of contexts and in the for-profit kind of context. One reason is that even many of the examples of private sector gamification, this here is Foursquare, the great massive success story of a marketing-oriented business, a mobile social location service valued at several $100 million with 20 million registered users. Look, Foursquare ain't profitable yet either. So the difference between them and something like Fold It is not quite as great as you might think. Frankly, in general, the difference between gamification in these contexts is not so different because gamification is fundamentally about motivation. And it's about typically using motivations other than money to encourage and incentivize and reward people for doing things. And so you can use those various kinds of motivational techniques in a for-profit business. But you can use often the same ones, and often they are a better fit in a community or nonprofit kind of context. Next slide, please. And in particular, in these kinds of situations, gamification can be a valuable tool because these are situations, these social impact, nonprofit, community engagement contexts, they are situations that are all about intrinsic motivation. So psychologists talk about extrinsic and intrinsic motivators. Extrinsic means you are motivated for some reason outside of the task at hand. So that might be, I go to work not because I just love my work so much, but because they pay me. Or that might be because my friends, when I get to work, say, you're really great. I don't really like the work, but I like people telling me I'm really great. Those are all extrinsic motivators. On the other hand, there's intrinsic motivation. I go to work, and I would do it even if nobody paid me because it's so much fun, because I get so much direct, inherent personal reward from the activity. That's intrinsic motivation. And there are decades of psychological research that have shown that intrinsic motivation is extraordinarily powerful. It's kind of intuitive. It's nice if you are doing something for the hope of a reward. But that reduces the activity, if you're not careful, to basically a bribe. So you want to find tasks where motivation matters. It's not true in every task. There are some tasks that people will do just because they have to. There are some tasks that people will not do, no matter how motivated they are. The sweet spot are tasks that people intellectually believe that they should do or they want to do, but they just don't have that feeling behind it. And so gamification can be a great technique to get people over that motivational hump. So you want to identify the situations, and they can be any kind of task, but tasks where motivation is a key gating factor. The second one is meaningful choices. So Sid Meier is a very famous game designer, designed the Civilization series of games. His definition of what a game is the following. A game is a series of meaningful choices. And I think that's very profound in lots of ways, but important for gamification. You have to give the users, the players, some options. And that can mean anything. That can mean options in terms of the path that they take, the activities they choose, or it could be some options in terms of whether they are going to just dip their toe in the water or really go full bore and try to get to the end of the funnel, the top level of the game. People need to have those options, and they need to feel ownership of the choices they're making. We call that autonomy. And that's something, again, in the motivational literature that's very important, that people feel like they have made meaningful choices in what they are doing. And meaning is in the eye of the beholder. Again, it's not necessarily something that leads to some verifiable, externally recognized result. It's something that's meaningful to the player. The third is, can those behaviors be modeled? Gabe talked about analytics. Gamification systems, when we're talking about building or using these platforms, are typically about encoding these kind of fuzzy motivational things in software, in rules, in algorithms. So the best kinds of situations for gamification are situations where there's the possibility to track and record behaviors and to model those meaningful choices that the users are making in some way that you can actually see what's going on, do the analytics, tweak the system, improve the behavior, and give the users that feedback that they need, which is very powerful.
We're trying to figure out how to better fundraise and to also get people to become mentors and commit to that. So we're having a difficult time like figuring out, should we gamify something to engage people about the stats and the effectiveness of diversifying our industry, or like we don't know where to go.
And the thing that I always say is like, companies are not, even though the Supreme Court would like to have you believe this, companies are not entities with their own self-determination. Mm-hmm. All decisions inside of businesses are made by people. They're all made by people. Somebody writes a check, somebody signs a PO, somebody contracts for something. And so even if your context is a B2B engagement, you're still building a motivational system that's designed around the people in question. So the first step of doing this in any context, which is there's kind of a process in my book, but the simple high level for it is you always start by writing down the story of your principal player. And so if in your case it's the ad agency exec who has to write you a check or hire these interns or whatever it is or mentor them, whatever it is that you're looking for. So you want to write that person's story for starters so that you can understand where they're coming from. And I usually make people focus on that person's fears and their aspirations, rather than they're a 45-year-old man who lives in an apartment. That's not interesting. What's interesting, what drives them emotionally, what makes them afraid and what makes them optimistic. And then if you start from that point, you get to understand that person, and then you need to know your metrics, right? And then you need to know what system ties together where that person's coming from and what you need them to do for you, to Kevin's sort of point. And in order to make these projects work, no matter what it is that you're going to do, you need to have a super clearly articulated problem statement for your organization and define the metrics inside of your organization that will make this a win, right? Because if it's mentorship and raise money and raise that placement rate, then you will never design one system that's going to accomplish all of those things and do that well. So I would push back on you and say, okay, well, let's pick a problem. Let's start with a problem. Let's define the person the people involved in that problem, what their aspirations are, right, and what their fears are. let's define what makes a win for your organization in as concrete of terms as absolutely possible, then you may start the process at that point of designing something that connects those two things together. But the large amorphous thing, you'll never get anywhere with that.
The initiative is called Digital On-Ramps. For people to look at digital on-ramps as a trusted network, they have to believe that real knowledge is getting gained as people are using these systems. And so that's, to me, when you're talking about education and when you're talking about kind of real world application, is something that I really want to know more about and what people's experiences are in terms of measurements.
One Trojan horse for me about the badges is it really starts to help rethink assessment of student work or learner work. And what's exciting there is it actually starts to reintroduce, things that we know are much deeper engagement with learning, like portfolio and actually assessing the work, right? So, and what's exciting about the badge is that they can link to or contain the data towards a set of either curated or examples of work that some kind of person in authority, school, teacher has assessed that others can then look at, is something that's completely devalued in the current educational system, right? What is an A, even if you know what the percentage means nothing, right? There's no way to understand what was to be assessed, what were the metrics that meant that A. So I think in some ways, the badges in an educational context, totally the game changer is that it actually reintroduced age-old ideas about how we actually assess whether somebody's learned something or not, that sort of end around the sort of standards and typical test-based assessments that have dominated. Sort of reminded me a little bit when Gabe was talking about the sort of two different kind of games, the checkbox game and the sort of more open-ended game space. Well, it actually reconfigures assessment, which to most educators now is a bit of a dirty word because of the hierarchy of standardized tests.
It's sort of going back to your example about landing the plane, but he's 12 years old. I'm talking about someone who is 55 years old, his brain isn't wired to multitask. I'm talking about kind of how do I, and what data is there to even suggest that this type of thing is worth.
Game reality thing is an issue, right? So I think, Arun, you're on the right track in terms of if it's simulation stuff plus physical stuff. I think you're better off. I mean, and really going back to planes, one of the, that's a great metric in that, the FAA will accept X number of flight hours, in Microsoft Flight Simulator, right? To a certain extent. You can't get 100% of your flight hours that way. You get, what is it? 20, 25%, something, right? There is a metric in which X amount of time on a simulator, even a commercial simulator, if it's been certified, is acceptable as a swap. So you need to validate the individual's work. You need to look for these kind of metrics in the external world. You're also going to need, and this is where your advisory board comes in, which I assume you have, right? If you go to picturetheimpossible.com, look at that video that's there first, and then go to the YouTube channel we have for it. You will see people from, 6 to 60 who played the game and were outside in nasty weather every weekend just to do stuff like, scavenger hunt about culture in your town, right? So one of the things that surprised us, in fact, was how wide a spread of demographics we had in terms of that. So that'll hit that.
This is a great question and comes up a lot. And in fact, we have a whole kind of session on this at G Summit, sort of, but it's corporate, but it's the same problem basically. And I was asked this kind of outside the question about age and views on gamification, and the biggest divide is really age related in terms of how people respond to this based on my experience. So if you're like a millennials, you're like under 25, you're 20 or like under, basically when someone says gamification, you go, duh. And then when you're like over 50, there's all these objections that start coming up like, well, but this is serious and that's gaming as well. Okay, so I would do a couple of things just to be really tactical. The first thing that I would do is I would probably use the word game less, just because I think it makes it easier to have this discussion with people who are kind of antithetical to this idea. So I would use that word less and talk more about motivation, talk about incentive, right? Talk about interaction. I'd bring the discussion around the other way and I'd say, everybody likes to play. People like to play different kind of games, right? So you may not think that video games are very interesting, yes? But I'm sure that you think golf is really interesting to you, or you really like frequent flyer programs, which are an example. So there's all these patterns that you can deploy if you know the person in question to kind of make this conversation happen a little bit better. And then often, as I gave sort of the example before, well, actually, this is a fun one. I won't name the company, but I will tell you. So I got a panicked call from a company that does investment-related software. And this is a software tool that people use to invest in various things. And so their principal audience is a man in his late 50s who's very rich. And what they had decided to do was implement a gamification concept kind of haphazardly from one day to the next. And what they did was they gave people levels, okay, in their system. And they were in the form of kind of badges. So basically, people could be a shark, a whale, a bull, or a bear. Okay? Now, shark, whale, bull, and bear are all terms that investors use to describe a particular investment philosophy, right? That is a known metaphor in the investment world. However, this company chose to represent them as cartoon objects on their profile. So when you visit this one investor's profile, there's a cutesy shark on his profile, hey, this guy's a shark. Needless to say, they started getting really angry phone calls. What the fuck? Why is there a whale on my profile? Okay. So I kind of steered them back and I said, look, good idea, wrong execution. You didn't think about your customer, right? You designed something that you thought was the literal expression of this idea, but instead, you probably should have done green, gold, platinum, and black, which would be a leveling system that would be more neutral that that same community would understand. It's American Express cards. You could have done something like Challenger, Gulfstream 4, right? Global Express, okay? Another system that they would have understood. The point being, you could choose something that was appropriate. And so in every case, knowing this person, making it appropriate, I de-emphasize games a little bit, and I'd focus on interactions. SAPS, which stands for status, access, power, and stuff. And that's the order, that's the a priori list of types of rewards that you want to give people. They're not mutually inclusive and they're not mutually exclusive. Different kinds of rewards are meaningful in different contexts. Status type of rewards happen to be the most long-lasting. They're the most enduring. They're the ones that drive the most long-term behavior in our reward structure. So that's why they're at the top of the list. But other ones can be really powerful and mixed. Like, for example, power rewards, which let people choose, give other people benefits or inhibitions or decide what happens or what doesn't happen, like a moderator on Wikipedia is an example of somebody who gets a great power benefit. Those can be really meaningful in the right environment. Access benefits are things where people get access to something they can't get on their own. So for example, that may be the benefit model that works best for you. It's like if you do the best performance here, you get an audience with the CEO or the Dalai Lama or something like that, right? And then stuff, which is to your kind of last question, the free things, discounts, money, as benefits, they're not necessarily bad, they're just weak actors, okay? And they're just really weak actors that weaken over time, and they weaken dramatically over time. And at some point, you need the kind of, you have to acknowledge the long-term kind of economic decision that you're making when you start with stuff, because the problem with stuff is, once you give it, it's very hard to take it away. Right. If I give you a reliable benefit, like $1,000 a week to come in and work for me, and then all of a sudden I decide I can't afford $1,000 anymore, now I can only afford $800, suddenly you're like I'm really pissed. Okay, so the summary is on that, and there's a really interesting talk about the legal issues of stuff as well, that James Gatto did about kind of the law and gamification and benefits. I'm sure Kevin can talk about that at length too. But what I would say is generally avoid free stuff benefits for as long as you possibly can.
Even if everyone is designing great systems, if as my life increasingly becomes online and as this proliferates, I could see sort of a backlash. I don't want to have to remember another trophy case.
The Mozilla OBI infrastructure is one starting point, one piece of intermediary infrastructure. We'll need a whole lot more of them. And also some things will rise to the top. So, just as, with social networks, there were a whole lot of them, but most of them faded out vis-a-vis Facebook or became part of Facebook. That'll happen here, but you're right, in the interim, there are going to be these kinds of situations. It's not necessarily that bad though, because there's some subset of people who just think this stuff is cool and are gonna go get badges to get badges. But most of what we're talking about are people in specific communities where, again, if the system is done right so that it has value in meeting within that community or for that audience, then it really doesn't matter what's happening in the rest of the world.
There's a sense that we can easily divide intrinsic and extrinsic motivation and rewards, but the truth is we can't. We can't do that because of one, and it's brought together in this concept called self-determination theory. If you're interested in this topic, it's actually very eloquently summarized. If you want an extrinsic reward badly enough, you internalize it. It's a very, very simple concept. So you want to be CEO of your company? Is that an extrinsic or intrinsic reward for your action? It's unclear, but once you decide that you want that thing, right, it becomes very internal. So the trick is, if you're designing experiences, to make those things that people want.
We made many different types of ways to engage. Outside activities, on the web activities. So not everyone had to do everything, but they could find different ways to engage and involve themselves. So that's A. And B, we knew within those different kinds of engagement, we'd also have people who were doing it at a very cursory level and people who were full in. So we had around 2,500 people play. We had 18 people who went and got every single point in every possible category of the game. You can't expect everyone to be that involved, but you want to look at the whole range of the audience to figure out how you can match as many different pieces as possible. When you're doing a full game, or if you're doing a social game, a little harder when you're doing gamification because you want it to be light to begin with. But that kind of mentality is, how do I keep the guy who has 15 memberships in 15 different hotel groups and never scores with any of them, as well as the platinum flyer for United, right? You want to try to engage them all.